Hello and welcome to today's webcast, brought to you by the Center on Knowledge Translation for Disability and Rehabilitation Research, or KTDRR, at American Institutes for Research, and the University of Kansas Research and Training Center on Independent Living Project for Promoting Interventions for Community Living, known as RTC/PICL. The Center on KTDRR and the RTC-PICL are both funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, or NIDLR, in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Community Living. I'm Joanne Starks with the Austin Office of American Institutes for Research, or AIR. I also want to thank my colleagues Shoshana Rabinovsky and Stephen Boydston, who are helping with the logistics today. In today's webcast, Multifaceted Interventions for Improved Community Participation Among Adults with Disabilities, our presenters will discuss the systematic review carried out by a team from the RTC project Promoting Interventions for Community Living. This review contributes to research identifying multifaceted interventions that are effective in facilitating increased community participation for adults with disabilities. Technical assistance from the Center on KTDRR helped support the review team's activities in order to submit the review to the Campbell Collaboration's Disability Coordinating Group. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers as listed on this slide. Judith Gross, PhD, is the Director of the Center on Community Living and Careers at the Indiana Institute on Disability and Community. Previously, she was Assistant Research Professor at the University of Kansas, working with the Research and Training Center on Independent Living. In that capacity, she led the team that conducted the systematic review of multifaceted interventions leading to community participation outcomes for a NIDLR grant on promoting interventions for community living. Jeanne Hall, PhD, is Director of the Research and Training Center on Independent Living and a senior scientist in the Lifespan Institute at the University of Kansas. Nationally recognized for her research related to healthcare, employment, and independent living for people with disabilities, Dr. Hall is leading the current study of interventions that promote community participation, and she will be available during the question and answer part of the presentation. Amalia Monroe-Gulick, MLS, is an associate librarian with the KU Libraries. As a member of the team, she assisted with design and implementation of multiple library searches for systematic and scoping reviews, including the present systematic review. Chad Nye, PhD, is a consultant for KTDRR and conducted the data analysis for the systematic review team. He is a former executive director of the Center for Autism and Related Disabilities and professor at University of Central Florida, College of Health and Public Affairs, and he has over 20 years of experience in the area of meta-analysis and systematic reviews in the area of disability. I am representing the Center on KTDRR on behalf of Principal Investigator and Project Director, Dr. Kathleen Murphy. Now, let's get started. Again, if you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat box and we'll hold them over to answer at the end. I will now hand things over to Judith Gross. Judith?
Thanks, Joanne. And thanks to everyone online who has joined us today. We appreciate it. On the screen now is our agenda for the next hour. First, we will discuss why one would conduct a systematic review or meta-analysis. Next, we'll talk about the partnerships that supported this research. Then we'll discuss what we did, how we did it, and what we learned. And finally, we'll discuss the implications of our findings and have some time for question and answer at the end. So, why would we conduct a systematic review or meta-analysis? So first and foremost, a systematic review provides us with a formal, structured approach to reviewing all of the relevant and best available literature on a specific topic or outcome of interest. So it provides this nice overview of the current state of the literature. And it is systematic in its process in that the procedures for conducting the review are clearly defined in advance, making them replicable while also minimizing bias. A systematic review can be qualitative or quantitative. But regardless, the procedures for determining inclusion and method of analysis are still determined in advance and well documented. Systematic reviews. The studies included in systematic reviews are screened for quality to ensure that the findings of a large number of studies can be combined. The procedures for determining inclusion in the study must address both issues of content relevance as well as research quality. In addition, peer review is a key part of the process of our procedures in our systematic review. So in order to conduct a systematic review, to get that overview of the current state of the literature, we must have some clearly defined inclusionary and exclusionary criteria, an explicit search strategy, so one that is structured and taking into account the differences in the databases you're looking in. It also needs to have a systematic coding and analysis process, so something that is consistently done across researchers throughout the study. And a systematic review should include a meta-analysis whenever possible. So what is a meta-analysis? So a meta-analysis is when we conduct a statistical analysis of the impact of the outcome of interest. So when we look across all those studies and we identify our outcome of interest, we can use statistics to combine those outcomes and look at the overall effect of the treatment. So by combining those samples of the individual studies, that overall sample size is then increased, and that increases the statistical power of the analysis as well as the estimates of those treatment effects. So how do partnerships support this research? When Joanne was introducing, she mentioned that KTDRR had helped with supporting this research. So I had previously worked at the University of Kansas with the Research and Training Center on Promoting Interventions for Community Living, and conducting a review of the literature was a part of their grant project plans that they had to conduct, to implement their program for promoting community interventions. So in that work, we partnered with a university librarian who'd worked with the center multiple times on other projects, as well as had a research assistant and used the grant dollars to help fund the systematic review as required in one of our grant activities. Joanne?
Thanks, Judith. The Center on KTDRR is funded by NIDLR to promote the use of high-quality disability and rehabilitation research that is relevant to the needs of intended audiences, including people with disabilities and their families, researchers and policymakers, among others. Technical assistance activities are designed to support the knowledge translation efforts of NIDLR grantees, and we provide individualized assistance for any NIDLR grantee interested in developing systematic reviews and research syntheses. KTDRR worked with the Kansas team to submit the review to the Campbell Collaboration's Disability Coordinating Group. The Campbell Collaboration is an international organization that promotes positive social and economic change through the production and use of systematic reviews and other evidence synthesis for evidence-based policy and practice. The coordinating groups are responsible for the production, scientific merit, and usefulness of Campbell systematic reviews. The requirements of a Campbell review are considered the gold standard of systematic reviews, and KTDRR provided in-kind assistance to support statistical work and research assistance to help the team to meet Campbell's high standards. The title and protocol for the review are available in the Campbell Library, and we anticipate the final review will be published there very soon. KTDRR staff work closely with Campbell's Disability Coordinating Group by volunteering in some leadership roles. KTDRR also has a cadre of consultants with a range of experience in providing support in both research, synthesis, and systematic reviews. The KTDR website also provides free access to numerous online resources and training materials. Interested NIDLR grantees can contact KTDRR for additional information at ktdrr.org/TA. Thanks, and back to you, Judith.
Thanks, Joanne. So with the support of KTDRR, we were able to take what was originally just a systematic review, which was a part of our work on community participation, and turn it into a meta-analysis. KTDR provided some of the consulting support that was needed to be able to conduct the meta-analysis. So what exactly did we do then? So for our work on community participation, we had actually conducted 2 studies as a part of the systematic review because we had multiple research questions of interest. First, we conducted a meta-analysis of 15 quantitative studies to determine the effectiveness of multifaceted interventions in promoting community participation. However, it was also within our research interest to learn more about the nature of those interventions. So we also conducted a qualitative analysis of the content of those 15 articles, in addition to 2 quantitative articles whose data could not be included in the meta-analysis, and 3 qualitative articles that we had also found in our search. We qualitatively analyzed the content of these articles to better understand the identified components of such interventions. And the results of the qualitative study are not included in the meta-analysis being presented today, but are presented in a separate research article. So how did we do it? So first we needed to define the outcome we were really looking at. So community participation is huge. It encompasses many different things. So we had to look carefully and think about how we defined the terms. What was a community participation outcome? What constituted a community-based setting? What exactly did we mean by multifaceted interventions? Because as we were looking through the literature, that in itself was defined differently in different ways, in different articles. So we worked closely with our scientist consumer advisory panel to clearly define the target for our review. So the Research and Training Center on Promoting Interventions for Community Living had a scientist and consumer advisory panel that supported the providing advice on the review, as well as helping us to answer key questions or concerns that we had about what should be included or what those inclusionary or exclusionary criteria really should be. So for the purpose of this review, we had defined multifaceted interventions as an interventions that seek to address 2 or more individual or environmental characteristics in different domains. So what that meant, 2 or more individual characteristics might mean changing something about the person, such as enhancing their knowledge or skills, or changing their behavior, or changing their perceptions or attitudes. And environmental characteristics included changing something about the people, places, or things in the environments in which that person interacts. And we specifically sought out different domains because it became difficult to think about how to distinguish something as multifaceted, because we had a lot of different opinions on what that actually looked like. So by defining it as the multifaceted intervention was addressing different domains, it made it much clearer as to what actually counted as a multifaceted intervention. So by that, we meant that it could be an intervention that targeted, say, social skills and employment skills, or transportation and access to community, engaging in community recreation activities. So we were looking specifically that the intervention would address 2 different domains in that person's life. So who did we include? Well, who were the participants in these studies? So all of our participants in the studies were 18 years of age or older, identified as having 1 or more disabilities. So we did not distinguish. This was not a disability-specific study. It was cross-disability. And when we considered aging populations, disability is defined a little differently when we enter aging populations. So we defined it by limitations in activities of daily living and instrumental activities of daily living. We also, our participants, another way that we chose to limit or target, focus our study was to limit our participants to those who had exited the secondary education high school setting and services. So specifically, this excludes transition service activities that students may be engaged in while still enrolled in secondary education. Amalia, you want to cover conducting the search?
Yeah, thank you. So the first step in the search process after working with the outcomes and the participants was to identify the electronic databases we were going to use. So after reviewing 15 databases and a publisher journal package, we selected 3 databases for our initial searching, PubMed, Web of Science, and PsycInfo. And then the process of building the search took some time. We eventually decided on 2 search concepts, disabilities and interventions. And the goal was to ensure that all types of disabilities were included in the search results while excluding the irrelevant results. And database provided subject and or classification limiters were utilized to reduce the number of results since our review search was really broad. For example, the use of limiters was very necessary in Web of Science because that database does not have a controlled vocabulary feature. And then 2 additional databases, ProQuest Dissertations and Theses Global and Policy File were also later searched to identify potential relevant gray literature. And the results of all searches were exported into EndNote and deduplicated for review. Process, search strategies, and results were documented in Excel. And now back to Judith, who then will discuss the next step in the process.
Thanks, Amalia. So after we had conducted the search, and that took quite a bit of collaboration among ourselves as a research team, as well as going back to our scientist and consumer advisory panel when we would run into vocabulary challenges. So ultimately, we ended up with 4,742 articles from those searches. And we reviewed all of those by abstract and title, and there were at least 2 researchers who were involved in each review stage of the articles. So after reviewing those 4,742 articles, we figured out we had maybe about 186 left that we really needed to look more carefully at that full text to make sure that they met our criteria for inclusion and that it met our definitions for community participation outcomes, as well as determining whether or not it was a multifaceted intervention. Out of those 186, we ended up reviewing 37 for methodological quality, and out of those 37, we ended up with 15 studies, 15 quantitative studies that were measuring outcomes related to community participation that could be included in the meta-analysis. So when we talked about community participation, we had a couple of ways in which we were defining community participation outcomes. So we had primary outcomes, which were those with direct access to the community. So things like employment or post-secondary education, community recreation activities, or housing. Activities or outcomes that very clearly were placed physically within the community. That it was easy to say this is, a community participation outcome. However, in our research, we know that there are a lot of outcomes that are strongly associated with community participation. Whether it's community participation is known to be associated with them or seems to be a dimension of community participation, such as physical health. We know that if somebody has strong physical health, they're more likely to access the community. Same goes for being self-determined or having a social network or a high quality of life. So we looked at those other outcomes as what we considered to be dimensions of community participation. So outcomes that we knew were associated with community participation, but maybe were not directly reflected as being located within the community. Chad, you want to talk about the analysis?
Okay. So we used the comprehensive meta-analysis software, CMA, for our meta-analysis aspect of it. That software allows us to take the coding form that we use to define design participant study characteristics, participant characteristics, outcome characteristics, and analyze them according to those categories, if you please, of independent variables. So we got 74 effect sizes, a total of 74 effect sizes were generated from the 15 studies. We were able to combine or aggregate some of those data that we'll present here in a few minutes. The studies found some positive effects, primarily in the employment, mental health, adult ed, and quality of life studies. Two other studies that met criteria for inclusion but weren't included in the data analysis part because we were just unable to convert the base data into a metric that would be analyzable by meta-analysis process, the effect size calculations. So our 15 studies reflect the studies in which we could generate an effect size based on the data presented. Judith?
Thanks. So what did we learn from our study? So one of the things that was fairly interesting in our findings was that most of the participants had a disability that makes executive functioning a challenge. So 2 of our studies had participants who identified as having a traumatic brain injury. 7 focused on people with mental health needs. 4 were focused on those who were aging and having acquired disabilities with aging. And 1 focused on individuals with developmental disabilities, and another study did not report the disability of their participants. So that became an interesting piece to observe because many of the multifaceted interventions that were being used in these 15 studies were specifically focusing on a cognitive coaching component. So it may have been something to help improve memory or increase some sort of executive functioning, organizational skills, or management of some sort. There were a number of countries represented, so 10 of our articles represented participants from the U.S. 1 was from Italy, 1 from China, 1 from Australia, and 2 from Germany. So we had an international representation as well. General study characteristics of those 15 studies, we had searched from 2000 to 2016, but the 15 studies fell in that range of 2000 to 2014. 74 effect sizes were computed with a mean of 5 and a range of 1 to 22. And the length mean of treatment was 27 weeks, and that ranged from 4 weeks to 105 weeks. And I don't have a detailed number of participants here because I've been struggling with getting a piece of software to open where that data is stored. But I do know that in our treatment groups, we had well over 2,000 participants in total and well over 1,400 in the control group. But there are a number, I don't have exact numbers on that. So we had a good participant size to work with as well. Chad, you want to share about our other findings?
Okay. So let me preface this one with a little observation or statement. Sometimes we look to research and publish work, kind of an attempt to identify a specific answer to a problem or a clinical setting, a patient, etc. And for a single patient even, sometimes for a group, Sometimes we're successful in finding that answer. Often, though, we're not, because we have a hard time finding a study or a result that matches the condition we're working in or we're looking in. At best, we get partial answer. Sometimes we get no answer. And what I find is that a lot of times readers for the meta-analysis are disappointed that they don't seem to have a specific answer to their question here about treatment effectiveness or intervention effectiveness. They only end up with an incomplete answer. So I point this out to say that the systematic review and meta-analysis is intended to summarize the existing research in a way that allows us to have a kind of a cumulative picture, if you please, of the available research on a particular topic, and to do it in a way that kind of focuses our understanding of what we know, what we don't know, what needs to be done or should be done to advance the knowledge base. So we don't typically find a specific and incontrovertible evidence result in a meta-analysis. In fact, what we really have is kind of an average statement of the treatment effect. So the more information we have, then the closer we get to some level of specificity, at least some of the time. So it's with that sort of in mind that I'm starting this part of the presentation to say what we have here is a statement of the current state of what we believe anyway. It represents our best knowledge of a multifaceted intervention. So this slide shows you this individual studies. The effect size is Hedges G. That's a procedure that's done to give credit to smaller end studies so that they are more equitably included in the aggregation of the data. The lower and upper limits at a 95% confidence interval and the p-value. So if you notice, there are in Hedges, under the Hedges G, the effect size, there are 3 studies that have negative effects. That's for the study. So what that is saying is basically saying that the treatment group performed less well, or let me say that differently. Control group did better than the treatment group. That's probably not an answer we're looking for. In the other studies where you find a positive effect size and a positive lower limit and upper limit, such as the Gutman study here, then we know that the treatment condition performed significantly better than did the control condition patients or participants. But if you take that same principle and apply it over here, look at the lower limit where you have negative effect sizes, and in this case, about, I think 8 studies here have negative effect sizes. And in fact, what it's saying is that the result could be such that the control group would have performed better than the experimental group. And you see that in the fact that the p-values are not statistically significant. Somebody's going to ask or say, well, yeah, but the overall effect is positive, lower limits positive, upper limits positive. And that comes as a result of the grouping, the aggregation. Now, this is not data that we're going to hang our hat on. I do this when, this is a kind of a personal thing as much as anything. I like to do this so I can get a look at the individual studies and their overall results, keeping in mind that, in effect, what we're doing here is taking a view from 30,000 feet where we've included, or we're not accounting for things like differences in study design, whether it's a randomized trial or a quasi-experimental trial. We're not accounting for differences in participant characteristics such as numbers of participants or participant classifications. So all of the independent variables that are in that form that we use to collect information about the characteristics of the studies are just lumped together. It gives me a kind of a place to begin. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some of the more specifics and at least at a few of the ones that we have dealt with to this point. So I've set up a sample from each of these categories, a couple of design characteristics to look at, are there differences in treatment effects based on the scientific rigor of the design, if you please. Treatment characteristics, length of treatment is one that we're always interested in. And some outcome characteristics here. The measurement, the outcomes that were measured that showed significant or non-significant differences. And so the number of studies then associated with each of these outcomes. So you might see here that there are some studies with 1 or 2 studies. Remember, we can do a meta-analysis with 2 studies. But just as you would not make confirming kind of confirming kind of conclusions based on 2 subjects in a study, we wouldn't do that either with meta-analysis. What it does do is gives us sort of an inkling, if you please, or potential direction. Same with the single studies. We can calculate an effect size, but it's not going to provide us with a result that is confirming position. So these are the results for the employment outcome. In our study here, we had 5 studies that identified as randomized trials. Let's just take a second to look at that one. We have one study that has negative effects all the way across, another that's non-significant, even though it has a positive effect. You notice the range. Some of them, the range from a minus 1.12 to as high as a 0.89. So there's a fair amount of variability there. But when we combine these studies, just based on the design, we still end up with a non-significant treatment effect. You might say, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that the issue, at least in terms of design, may be a factor in explaining some of the results that we have generated in employment, the employment outcomes. And let's take a look at one of those potential ones. So one of the things we wanted to look at was a method of analysis. That is, did the intention to treat, the ITT, methodology differ from those studies that used a test-only treatment procedure? That is, an intention to treat, everybody gets a pre-post measure, even if they don't complete the study. There's an attempt, at least, to estimate what the results would be if the person had completed the study. And if it's the test-only treat, it means we only assess pre and post those participants who had data available for that purpose, or before and after. So you can see that the intention to treat shows a statistically non-significant effect. That is, the treatment groups didn't do as well as the control groups in those studies, whereas on the test only, there was a pretty significant effect, and it was fairly large. The interesting thing about this is that it gives us at least the attempt to make some kind of a judgment here about the impact of the method of analysis. You might say, okay, what difference does that make? Well, at least in terms of philosophically, if you view the success of an intervention based on just those who are participating in the intervention, this might suggest that employment results for people with disabilities who participated in these 3 studies has a significant impact on their performance. If you view the intention to treat kind of analysis as a representative of a more real-world representative of the nature of interventions and training programs and instructions in general, where people leave the leave the program, drop out for whatever reason, then the results are not nearly as impressive, to say the least. So that's our attempt at least to look at one of the design factors related to the employment results. If we look at length of treatment, in the 5 studies, these were the way they broke down. Now, 1 to 10 weeks and 20 plus weeks is somewhat arbitrary. It's really a 4 weeks for the MRSA and McGirt, the 1 to 10 weeks, and the remaining ones ranged from, I believe it was 54 to 105 weeks. Much larger differences there. But there is potentially, anyway, the idea that the shorter interventions resulted in a larger, more effective outcome, which would not be overly surprising. The question might be raised is, yes, but interventions often take longer, particularly when you're dealing with subjects with disabilities that it defined an effectiveness. These studies suggest at least that there's some question anyhow about the effectiveness of the interventions based on the length of treatment as that treatment is extended over a period of weeks beyond the 20 weeks. There was another set of studies that dealt with employment results, and these were studies where the experimental group was compared to another treatment. I call it treatment 1 versus treatment 2. We didn't include these in comparison or in aggregating across all outcomes in the employment category because they're a very different approach to the assessment of effectiveness. Think of it like this. You have treatment A and you have treatment B being compared, but you have no studies to know that treatment A, in fact, is effective, nor do you have studies that show that treatment B is effective. And these studies have taken treatment A and treatment B and are simply looking at is one more or less effective than the other. The result being, as you might expect, there are some for which there's no difference between the 2 studies, and in Cook's case, we got a significant difference for that outcome. There are only 2 studies like this, and both of them are not significant for that purpose. I guess all 3 of them show a result, but 2 of them are not significant. So there were follow-up assessments for employment in 2 of the studies. However, they both used different post-treatment measurement times, so we couldn't really collapse them. And one study had a significant effect while the other did not. This is the situation where you really only have 1 study, so an aggregation of those studies is probably not warranted here. It doesn't provide us any really useful information, if you please. So quality of life, for example, was another category where we got some significant result, but again, we have only 2 studies that reported outcomes of quality of life. One was an RCT where there was the experimental control, and there were aging PET participants, and they reported a significant effect with an effect size that's approaching a large effect. The remaining study used the comparison of 2 interventions, an experimental intervention and a comparison of treatment 1 and a treatment 2. The result was, again, not significant. Mental health, there were only 2 studies. They were dealt with, but they were both RCTs. They assessed mental health for aging patients. And in this case, the G is a negative, statistically negative result, suggesting that control group performed better than the treated group. So at least in terms of mental health outcomes, we didn't find a positive effect for the treated condition. And for adult education or adult learning, there was one study. It was a comparison study, again, of Treatment 1 and Treatment 2, where we're assessing social skills and tasks and interpersonal skill development in a more formalized training program, classroom kind of setting with the psychiatric disabled group, yielding a significant group difference for these participants. A large effect size, a fairly large effect size. That's of interest, at least to me, because the average human effect from intervention has, some have reported that about a 0.5 standard deviation, or a G of 0.5, would be considered a typical outcome. So whatever is going on in this study, potentially anyway, has some effects that are beyond what we might otherwise expect. And at least as a reader of this or interpreter of this, I'd say maybe we want to look at this particular study and see what they're doing there and try to assess what it is that might be driving that and follow that through with other studies that have some sort of similar process or design intact for their study, their research. Okay, so we got non-significant outcomes for these other 5 categories that were listed earlier in Judith's presentation. That is, the results did not show an advantage of the interventions in which these outcomes were measured for the control, or for the experimental group, that it was a non-significant result or comparison. Okay, thank you, Edith. Judith, I think it's back to you.
Thanks, Chad. Appreciate it. So what are the implications of what we found? So we found that there's limited support for the effectiveness of multifaceted interventions, but there is some support. So that suggests a need for more research to determine effectiveness broadly, as well as specifically in relation to community participation of adults with disabilities. So as I mentioned earlier, we looked at community participation fairly broadly. We included things like employment, continued adult learning, housing, civic involvement, recreation, navigating the community. Those were all outcomes that we considered to be direct access to or participation in the community. But we also looked at dimensions of community participation, such as the quality of life that we had mentioned, or improved health. So as we think about multifaceted interventions, we found the most support in employment. And employment, as we know, has a lot of contexts in it that are supportive of, that may require multiple interventions to address. For instance, people need transportation to work. There's just general employability skills. There's also those soft skills that folks need to have to be employed. So one thing to consider would be a narrowed focus on those outcomes, so maybe targeting specifically employment and looking for a group of adults with similar disabilities may kind of focus this in this study a little more for like a next step, to focus maybe on those populations who need that additional support in the areas of executive functioning, and on some of those more concrete outcomes like employment. When we look at practice, that is something else to consider. So as I mentioned, when we consider somebody's employment in the community, we need to look at a lot of things. There are a lot of barriers that come up, for example, to people being employed, whether it's accessible transportation, or social skills, or having work experience, or various other actual hands-on work skills, learning a specific task for a job. All of those can lend themselves to multiple points of intervention. And so when we looked at multifaceted interventions, we thought of them as things that could tap into multiple points of intervention where we know people need support in order to get to their outcome, whether it's employment or living in the community. So with the multifaceted interventions, that would be a thing to think of in practice is how do we use those interventions to improve those skills with an ultimate goal of increasing community participation. And so in considering the research on those, we want to make sure that there are measures that are going to not only measure the impact of the intervention, but that targeted outcome that we're looking for as well. Any questions or comments?
Well, thank you very much, Judith, Amalia, and Chad. We do have a couple of questions that we've received, so also I'd like to introduce Dr. Jeanne Hall, who's here to help answer our questions. And the first question I've got is, was there a way to distinguish if any of the groups that developed, conducted, or published these studies were themselves people with disabilities?
So none of the studies that were conducted were developed or conducted by people with disabilities, and none of the ones that were included in the study indicated that there was any support in regard to the research as far as participants supporting development of the research. So I think that would be an interesting thing to look into, but that did not come up in any of the articles that we had.
Okay, thanks very much for answering that one, Judith. And I was wondering, Chad, could you clarify what an effect size is for those of us that are non-researchers?
Okay. An effect size is the measurement of the effectiveness of an intervention or a treatment or an instruction on a particular variable between two groups. So I sometimes use the aspirin and ibuprofen model. Does aspirin work better than ibuprofen? Well, I think ibuprofen is the only thing to use. My wife thinks it's aspirin. So we find the studies that have compared ibuprofen to people who didn't take anything for their headache. I hate headaches. My wife finds all the studies for aspirin. And sure enough, we find out that they both are effective. So the effect size, at least, is saying that those two medications for headaches seem to work. The other way of assessing effect, or the assessment of the effectiveness of ibuprofen over aspirin then is another level of study where you compare subjects who've been treated with both. Does one work better than another? So you got two levels there to kind of think about it, the effect and the effectiveness of intervention.
Very much. We also had a question about the interventions that you discussed earlier, Chad. Can you give some examples of what some of those interventions were? I know it may be a little hard to pull them up, but that is the question.
Yeah, I think Judith can probably define that better than I can.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
Give it a go and I'll start.
So one example would be there was a study focused on improving employment outcomes, and it had a vocational services component, and it was working with veterans who identified as having mental health needs. And there was also a cognitive study component of it that helped work on things like time management, organizing and planning, and kind of being able to structure tasks. And so that helped with that cognitive component that we discussed. There were other studies, let me see if I can find another good example here. So I have another study focused on individuals with brain injury, and it had outcomes focusing on mental health, and it was trying to improve patients' access to the community. And trying to think of some others here. Let's see. I'm trying to find one that's not employment, so because we had so many that were focused on employment. Oh, the supported education one. So that again focused on adults with psychiatric disabilities, and that incorporated so it had a supported education program, so it incorporated some occupational therapy services and focused on helping individuals who attended to be able to manage some of that, the level of organization that was needed to complete the program, as well as to support individuals to participate in the program. Some of the occupational therapy skills were focused more on that executive functioning again, and helping folks to access the services and participate in education.
Great, thank you. Here's another question. What would you suggest to researchers designing multifaceted intervention studies to make sure that they can provide evidence of efficacy?
I would say making sure you have good measurement tools would be one, so that you're surely measuring the outcomes of interest and the impact of the intervention. Chad, recommendation?
Yeah, that would be a prime consideration. I think the other is to define the population carefully, and in the area of disabilities, it's not that you can do that with exacting, but you can describe it so that selection is better characterized, I guess, for the reader. I think you also need to look at the real question that's being asked and whether or not the tools that you would use for assessing the nature of the outcome, the quality of the outcome, are really appropriate and are really good tools. There's some debate in the literature about whether or not standardized measures should be used over observational. You know, that's kind of a clinical practice question. If you don't have good tools at a standardized level, then you have to, deal with what you have. Measurement's important, and design preparation is important. How do you handle dropouts? How do you handle people that don't complete? Do you have enough subjects in the data pool to be able to generate the kind of results you're hoping for?
Thank you. Judith, did you see the follow-up question about the social skills intervention, if you recall, if it was a CBT, and also if it's possible to get full citations of the articles that were included in the review?
I don't remember if it was a CBT, but yes, we can make sure that you get full citations.
Okay, thanks. We've only got about 4 minutes left here, but I think we can maybe squeeze in another question. What research gaps do you think are the most important to address in the near future?
I think with regard to multifaceted interventions, there's just not a lot of research that's looking at interventions in this way. There's, and how we define it is different. So there was one other systematic review in I think it was the Campbell collaboration library that covered multifaceted interventions, but was defining them differently than we did. So I think that part of that would be, as we're looking towards how do we use multifaceted interventions that can help us to address, those person, environment, context issues, that just making sure that, we're figuring out that's how we can clearly define that and having consistency in that across studies. So it's the multifaceted piece is a difficult one, and I know that it's one that we as a research team really struggled with. Like, is this multifaceted or not? And sometimes we just went round and round in circles trying to sort through that. And so I think that clearly identifying that piece of how people are defining multifaceted, we found that we had to get very specific in breaking that down, and then really seeking out opportunities to test whether or not multifaceted interventions are more effective. Because we know that there are so many points in time that there's never just one factor that makes something work, right? Our research is designed often to test one variable here or one variable there. But there's often so many things so many factors and so many contexts that feed into somebody being successful or an intervention working well. And I think that clearly sort of tapping into that piece and trying to parse out whether or not multifaceted interventions are truly impactful, and for which populations are they impactful. So the majority of our studies tended towards individuals who needed some help with executive functioning in managing tasks or organizing their day. So perhaps that is a key population to sort of start this more focused research with.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Judith. We are just about out of time. I see we have one more question. I don't know if we can squeeze that in. What quality of life measurement tools were popping up most frequently in your analysis of content for populations with disabilities?
Oh, I don't remember. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, maybe that's something that you
look them up.
And we can follow up by email after this. When we will be sending out an email to everyone once we have this ready for archive viewing, and so we can answer that question maybe at that time. So I want to thank everybody for being here today, and that's especially Judith Gross, Amalia Monroe-Gulick, and Chad Nye for sharing information about this groundbreaking systematic review. And for everyone who is registered, we will be sure to let you know when the final review is published with the Campbell collaboration. We hope you'll take a few minutes to give us some feedback about the webcast by filling out a brief evaluation form. The link is here on this slide. It will also be posted in the chat box, and we will send out that email with an evaluation link for everyone who can't get to it today. So I want to thank everyone for coming today. I also want to thank the AIR and University of Kansas staff who helped with planning and logistics. And of course, we want to thank NIDLR for their support to offer these webcasts and other events. We look forward to seeing you at the Center on KTDRR's next event, which will be this Thursday, November 1st at 1 p.m. Eastern. We're hosting a pre-conference webcast entitled KT 101, An Introduction to Knowledge Translation, or How to Become Impact-tastic. We also want to invite you to register for our 2018 online KT conference coming up next week during the afternoons of Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, November 5th, 7th, and 9th. Please visit our webcast at www.ktdrr.org for more details. Good afternoon, and thank you very much.